Well, good morning. My name is Dr. Larry Forst, and it's Wednesday at 10 a.m. and we get together with Lisa Nathan and Peggy Pisano. Lisa is a parent advocate and meditator, and Peggy Pisano is a school psychologist and advocate. And what we do is we have this exchange based upon our work with the ProActive Caring Program. The ProActive Caring Program was developed through our Center on Aging and Disability Policy. Dr. Jeffrey Kahana and I are the directors of that center at Mount St. Mary College. And 3 years ago, we were provided an opportunity to respond to an RFP from New York State DDPC, Developmental Disability Planning Council. And as a result of that, we were awarded a grant. We put together a team. I reached out to Elaine Sproat and asked if she would come on as the project director. And she actually had her fingerprints all over the actual grant application. And now we're into our third year. The intent was to be able to reach out to families who have individuals, persons with special needs, and be able to introduce them to mindfulness-based stress reduction. Now, when we first started, we were doing the small groups and 6-week groups. And great news, family members, we have a stress reduction program, but the only problem is trying to get there is going to increase stress. So what we did was we took the 6 weeks and we put 3 weeks online. And then we realized in order to increase our reach that we really, for the second year, we needed to morph into the train the trainer model. And with our strong collaborative agencies, and there's so many that, to be named, we started to do train the trainer. And we were now, in that rhythm, and then COVID-19 appeared. And as a result of that, we had all this content knowledge, but the reality is that how do we get it out? Because people were not going to be able to assemble. And what started off as an informal discussion between myself and Lisa and Peggy, because they had joined the grant probably about 8 months ago. And their position was going to be to work with school districts. And the overarching thinking wouldn't it be great if every IEP process started with a moment of meditation? It would just change the whole complexion and dialogue. But because schools were no longer in session, what started out as an informal discussion, now we're into our 9th episode, so to speak, of ProActive Caring School Exchange. And it's been wonderful. And they have done a tremendous job. And it's been so well received, both locally, on the state level, and also being recognized and really supported by national constituencies. So here we are today, and the focus is on building confidence and self-esteem, both internal and external, and from a mindfulness perspective. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Lisa and Peggy.
Okay, I'm going to start, but I'm not sure if you're hearing me because I'm only hearing sort of every other word, and I keep getting that unstable signal on my internet.
Well, we can hear you. We can hear you loud and clear.
You can. Okay.
Yeah.
I can't hear you. Again, I'm only getting every other word or so. So we came up with the topic of building confidence and self-esteem. It's a general topic, and it can be for adults and or children, but in this case, it's for children with special needs. So self-esteem, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. However, definitions are one's belief in oneself, one's understanding of his or her value, what we think, what we feel, what we kind of know about ourselves, and how that fits in our persona. Self-esteem can be favorable and unfavorable, and it can vary depending on situations. If you feel that you can do something well, then that sort of increases and enhances your self-esteem about that particular area, subject, activity. If you feel perhaps that you don't do something so well, you feel sort of less than in that particular area. So there are certain factors that sort of are inherent in self-esteem, and some of them are genetics and age and life experiences, social circumstances, and comparisons to others. The research shows that girls starting sort of at around third grade, do much more in the way of comparisons with other girls. They're prettier, they're smarter, they're taller, whatever. Boys, not so much. They sort of have more inherent, at least early on, self-esteem. So when we're talking about self-esteem, there are ways to build and enhance self-esteem. People with higher self-esteem values, who value themselves, more highly, sort of appreciate themselves and appreciate others more. They enjoy finding meaning in life and will often try things that perhaps they didn't ever try before, so that they can expose themselves to more things. They make their own decisions. They have less difficulty being manipulated by the decisions of others or the thoughts of others, and they're more individualized thinkers. They can concentrate on solving problems in their lives better. They can partialize those problems, think of a solution, and then work on that solution so that the problem can be solved. They can speak about their own opinions calmly and kindly. So when you have enhanced self-esteem, you generally aren't nasty or derogatory towards another when they're voicing an opinion that's contrary to yours. They oftentimes believe that they are an equal value to others, that they are just as good. And again, that's variable depending on what the situation is, but just as good as others. They also can handle criticisms better because they take that in and they look at that information as it relates to their thought processes about themselves, and then reject it or accept those criticisms. And the criticisms that they get from others aren't always considered negative. Sometimes they use those criticisms to work on something. When you have, an average self-esteem or better, then you have the ability to look at those criticism about yourself and try to modify perhaps what you're doing. The converse, difficulties with a lower self-esteem, and we could probably all guess what those are, but they increase anxiety and depression. And we've talked about anxiety in the past, but sometimes they increase anxiety in people and then often cause depression. And sometimes what they do is they cause the person to not want to expose themselves to things. Because they are anxious about those things. And then when we become anxious about those things, we retreat. They sometimes cause social difficulties. So for lower self-esteemed people, they may not expose themselves to social circumstances or social situations, and therefore they withdraw socially. Sometimes they create academic issues for kids, and often children with learning disabilities, and they start comparing themselves with what other students can do, and they look around the classroom and say, well, that person can read better than I can, and that person is faster at it, or that person understands better. So they do a lot in the way of comparisons, and then subsequently, at times, it decreases their ability academically. People also have, as adults, difficulty in jobs when you have lower self-esteem. You may not want to approach new and different venues in your job. You might not go for that job interview. You may not try to go for that job advancement because your feeling of self-worth and self-esteem is less than, and perhaps in your own mind, you're thinking, I don't match up. They have increased vulnerability. Sometimes they stay in relationships that are social or academic or what have you, that perhaps they might not have stayed in had they had a better self-worth. And sometimes they're very sensitive to criticisms. Again, when the criticism is warranted, even they're sensitive to those kinds of criticisms. So there are ways to enhance self-esteem for adults as well as children. And some of the ways they talked about just sort of globally enhancing self-esteem are to set sort of small, reachable goals, small steps to build on larger steps. Because when you accomplish something small, even though it may not be the total goal that you were hoping for, it's a way of feeling a sense of accomplishment. And when you feel those sense of accomplishment, it enhances your abilities and your feelings of self. And then acknowledging mistakes and acknowledging accomplishments. And again, I think I just talked about mistakes in that everybody makes mistakes, and mistakes sometimes enhance our abilities because we recognize that perhaps we don't want to do that again. And therefore we internalize that, and it helps build confidence and self-esteem. As adults, and I think as children too, as I mentioned before, third grade girls start doing this very early on, comparing yourself to others. When we compare ourselves to someone else, we often come up short. And so if we stop doing that, we can recognize that we have strengths in other areas as compared to maybe other people. One of the things they said in enhancing self-esteem for adults is kind of participate in today's world a little bit more difficult, but stay with people who sort of lift your spirits. If you're, with people who are, less happy, maybe more depressed, then it kind of brings yourself down. Give back to others. One of the things that I think was very important was that when you give back to others, you feel your self-worth increases. So volunteerism in today's world, there's certainly many opportunities to give back to other populations. Celebrate your achievements, no matter how small, and we talked about those small little steps, but a praise of self is an important thing. And one of the things that was, I think, pretty clear was change the things you can and let go of those things that you can't change. And that's a hard one to do, obviously, but if we recognize that we're not all great at everything, we may adapt our thinking and increase self-esteem. One of the other things that I thought was very interesting, and I think one of the women who was on our conversation last week mentioned that speak to yourself as you would speak to your friend when it comes to a particular activity. And I think she mentioned this. And so what would you say to a person that you care about with respect to a particular thing? So if not a good tennis player, to yourself, you might say, I'm a horrible tennis player, but to your friend, you might give better advice and more even advice in terms of motivating that person to play better tennis. So it's a way of learning how to talk to yourself, and we've mentioned that across the board over the past weeks. With respect to children, and children specifically with disabilities, but all children across the spectrum, there are other ways to increase and enhance self-esteem. Some of them are similar, but some are different. And so one of the things they said is give your child very simple choices so that they can learn to recognize that I had this choice, I made this choice, these are the consequences of this choice, good or bad, and then later on, they can either modify those choices and or use that ability to make choices when bigger choices and bigger issues come up. And so the more choices and the more a child understands those choices and the consequences, the better it is with respect to their self-esteem. Don't do everything for your children. And I think this is particularly important for children with disabilities because it's easier for the guardian or the parent to just do whatever, clean your room, and it's easier for you to make their bed than for them to make their bed or put their toys away or whatever it is, because you can do it more quickly and without a lot of huffing and puffing probably. So, but one of the things they said specifically is don't do that. Let them work on it themselves, even if it takes, way longer than it would have taken you for those tasks and activities that you have time to leave, then, let them do those things themselves. If you're in a rush, obviously, you have to modify what you're doing. And that was one thing also is that, when you're working on these things with your children, try to work on it at times when you in fact have time. So that, if you have to accomplish something and you have to get out the door, don't pick that time to train them to make their bed or what have you. So when it comes to mistakes, you have to explain to your child that everybody makes mistakes. And we understand this better as adults, but children, again, are comparing themselves, and especially children with disabilities. Oh, I can't do that. I don't know how to do that is often what they say. So explain that nobody's perfect and that everybody makes mistakes and that, in fact, you can learn from those mistakes. One of the most important things they talked about was praise, and we talked about praise a lot over the course of the last few weeks, but praising very specifically, because children are very attuned to understanding when praise is insincere or when praise is just, you're the greatest. That praise should be very specific to an activity. So if your child draws a picture and the picture is less than perfect, instead of saying you're the greatest artist, you could say, oh, I love the way you put those people or the whole family in that picture, and that looks like a nice happy family. So instead of, because then the praise is specific to the activity and it's more sincere than some kind of global praise that talks about how wonderful an artist they're going to be in their future. Give your child chores and responsibilities. Again, those are the little tasks that we can do. And then praise, again, for the specifics of accomplishments of those tasks and responsibilities. The other thing, the reverse of that is, if they don't accomplish those chores and activities, then, there's an acknowledgement of that as well, but you can't belittle the child. You have to kind of discuss with them what sort of went wrong and how we could fix it for the future. Don't compare your child to other children, and that's hard to do, and don't compare them to their siblings or other people in the family. And sometimes that's hard because we say, oh, your brother could set the table, why didn't you set the table, kind of thing. So try to be specific with your children and not compare them to each other. Everybody has strengths and weaknesses, and so if we acknowledge that that child might be good at something and this other child might be good at something else, I think that helps in the way of increasing and keeping self-esteem. Spend time with your child one-on-one, because then you can recognize the little things that they're doing so that in fact you can praise those and the whole system works. And this was, I thought, a very interesting thing. Let your child overhear you speaking to someone else about something that they did and they accomplished and something that was very good, because you're not praising them directly, but you are talking about them in a positive way. And if they can hear that, they can internalize that and recognize that, wow, mom really did, or dad or whomever really did acknowledge that I did a good job. Some games and activities they talked about that you could participate in with your child to increase and enhance self-esteem. And one of them was an interesting thing called a brag box or brag file or whatever you want to call it, where you kind of write a note. John made his bed, or John did the dishes, or whatever he did. John said something nice. He walked the dog, he petted the dog, whatever it is. And you put those little notes in a box and you keep them. And so at the end of the day, at the end of the week, or if your child's having a particularly bad day, you might take out some of those little brags, for lack of a better word, that you put in the box and go over them. Remember when you did this, remember when you did this, you did a great job with this. And so those are little ways of praising things that had been accomplished throughout the day. One of the other ways is, to choose, let your child choose a game, and you follow the game that they create, and they have to explain to you. And again, all of these things are sort of tied together. I think last week we talked about the same thing when it came to communication. So now we're talking about with regard to self-esteem, but have your child choose the game, have your child be the leader of the game, and have that child explain the game to you, and you just sort of follow. One of the easy games that they can do is follow the leader. And so, you can play that very easily with young children or children with disabilities. For very young children, and you can do this around your house, and you can do this on the outside, and you see this oftentimes in elementary schools, is they have children be the line leader. Children love to be the line leader in schools. And so if you're going somewhere, if you're doing something, if you want to have your child be the line leader of you or your family, you can do that and make a little game out of that. And then, as always, charting and graphing and giving stickers for and things of that nature, rewards for responsibilities, for chores, for things that kids accomplish, and then reviewing those things regularly with your child. So I think Lisa's going to talk about how we're going to move to a more meditative way of looking at self-esteem.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Peggy. You said so many things that were just like right on point. And two things I'd like to say before I start my presentation. One, what you said about talking about your child and having somebody indirectly hear the praise, I think is really a great idea, but to also be really, really careful about the opposite. Because, words can really hurt, and a child can, if they hear something that's negative towards them, they can really internalize that. So I love your idea about praising, overhearing directly like that. And the other thing is a story. I read this years and years ago, some famous ice skater, and she was working with a child, a young woman with intellectual disabilities, teaching her ice skating. And she said what made her most proud, she says, was when the girl learned how to tie her own skates over the time of all these lessons they had. She learned how to tie her own skates, and the ice skater said that was the proudest she felt, being able to have her to do this. So it just, and it stayed, that story stayed with me, because I have a child with intellectual disabilities, and I thought that was just a really nice example of that feeling of self-worth. All right, so I want to take us kind of internally for a moment. And ask, what stories do you tell yourself over and over again in your mind? Are you aware of them? Alone in your thoughts, are you kind to yourself, or do your stories involve shame, guilt, resentment, or regret? Do you feel unworthy, that you're not good enough? Do you have a habitual pattern of negative self-talk? Negative self-talk. Well, and you mentioned this a little bit, that stimulates the stress response in us. And over the long term can really lead to unnecessary worry, anxiety, fear, and feelings of low self-worth. The more often our thoughts, those negative thoughts, go by unchallenged, the stronger they become. And these negative thoughts, if left freely to roam in our minds, can have a profound impact on the way we see ourselves and the way we interact with this one precious life that we have. All right, so what is self-esteem? You brought that up. It's our sense of how worthy and capable we are, and refers to the extent to which we like, accept, and approve of ourselves. Okay, so how can meditation help improve self-esteem? Well, you can't just wish for genuine self-worth and self-esteem. You can't talk yourself into it. You have to break patterns of negative thinking. Thoughts trickle into our unconscious mind to become our core beliefs. But the good news is that no matter how ingrained they are, and how many years or decades you've developed negative self-talk, it's still possible to learn how to let them go. And the critical words here are how to let them go, how to release them. So meditation teaches you how to observe your thoughts without judgment, and gives you distance from those storylines that are looping in your mind, loosening the grip of those storylines. It gives you the ability to take a step back from your thoughts, kind of like an artist who has to step back to get a more objective viewpoint of their work. So thoughts are going to come, and when they come, and they will come, the idea is just to let them go without engaging with them, letting them pass by like clouds in the sky or like a leaf floating down a stream. You'll hear that a lot in meditation, in guided meditations, and truthfully, it took me a long time to really understand that concept. But you're simply observing and being curious about these thoughts without judgment. Again, the key words there are without judgment. So if your mind tries to seduce your attention, you simply bring it back to your breath and back to your body. Attention is a focused channel of awareness. And attention can also be called consciousness. And in order to be conscious, you have to be aware. All right, so I'm going to lay out some pretty heavy stuff here, but let's follow along with me. So when we channel our attention to the instrument we call our brain, it becomes the mind. And the mind is the brain in action. And the brain is designed to process information, but it's next to impossible to stop the thinking process when your attention is in the brain. And that's what makes it really easy for us to get stuck in our thoughts, constantly identifying with all the influx of thought processes, leaving us basically unconscious and captive in the state of our ego. But focusing on the breath brings us back to our body and takes us out of this process. All right, so we're going to do a little meditation. And we're going to settle in and see if you can make yourself even 10% more comfortable. And gently closing your eyes, connecting to your breath, feeling it come into your body, and release and connect to your body to feel what's supporting it, what you're sitting on. Taking a deep breath in, letting it go. And repeating that one more time. And just let yourself find a natural rhythm to your breathing and accept whatever it is. If it feels shallow, if it feels deep. Where do you feel your breath the most? Do you feel it coming in and out through your nostrils, the rise and fall of your chest, or in your throat? And can you feel it strongest? And give yourself permission to settle down, to do this, to take this time for yourself. When a thought arises, acknowledge that you're thinking. Gently come back to your breath. No judgment, no criticism. You cannot do this wrong. Accept whatever feelings or emotions may arise for you. Now you may catch yourself thinking, I don't see how this can help me, or I'm doing this wrong, or other people do this better than me. Just disengage by coming back to your breath. The more we practice, the easier it becomes to give less attention to our thoughts and not allowing them to define who we are. Come back to your breath. We get to know this inner critic that lives in our mind, but also affects our bodies and our hearts. Be curious. The way it presents, the way it makes us feel. And from this place of curiosity and awareness, we can cultivate some of that, being able to step back and gain a new perspective. Just enough perspective to enable us to interact with this inner critic a little bit more skillful, kind, and compassionate ways. And this takes commitment, practice, and time. It takes time to understand the incredibly strong superglue grip of your ego to negative thinking and to develop that ability to detach. But you absolutely have the power and ability to do this and to make true and lasting change in order to grow your best self. Meditation is incredibly simple, yet incredibly complex, and offers profound benefits. By letting go, you set yourself free. This is your life, your journey, and you deserve it to be the best one possible. Let's just connect back to our breath for a moment. Be grateful for taking the time for doing this. All it takes is showing up. All right, thank you, everybody.
Well, I have to tell you, this, we'd always hoped from the very beginning that the strength of this exchange would be Peggy looking at it from a behavioral perspective, from the school psychologist perspective, and you, Lisa, looking at it from the parent advocate meditator perspective. And everything takes practice. And I think that as we start to look at the message that you delivered today, the reality is it was seamless. I really liked the work that Peggy started to talk about regarding simple things like mistakes enhance your abilities. We all have stuff. There's, even in my private practice, if somebody shows up and they tell me that everything is perfect, that's a red light. There's nothing is perfect. We have good days and bad days. We have parts of good days. We have parts of bad days. The idea that Peggy emphasized about service and giving back to others. I think we've read this, we've witnessed it, we've seen it, we felt it, that you always feel better when you're not in your own head and you're helping somebody else. And what Peggy referenced was some of the behavioral strategies. I, like you, Lisa, really like that thing that she talked about letting the child overhear the praise rather than just, trying to amplify as a praise that's not realistic or not true. I really liked, Lisa, the stuff that the other thing that Peggy said was pick your time. It's almost like pick your battle. Figure out, when you're able to do this. And this whole idea of a brag box, I love that. And Lisa, then you started talking about, the stories and the things that we say to ourselves and the strategies, what do we say? Even in the meditation that you delivered, what did you ask at the beginning? Try to find yourself 10% more relaxed. That's very doable. And I think the thing that, the three of us have talked about, offline is the fact that we're not saying that, look, this approach that we have in the theme of mindfulness-based stress reduction is going to put you on a yoga mat for 45 minutes a day. That's not what this is about. If you get there, that's wonderful. Everybody that I know that I've talked to that has a meditative routine, they talk about it starting off so simple, a minute, 30 seconds, a pause, and then they build upon it, and the testimony that you brought to the table every week about the fact that it was almost like an awakening moment. There you were out walking your dog, realizing that there was a lot of things occurring in your life that were overwhelming and that you had to, it's like Albert Ellis, rational emotive therapy. He says, if you want to change, then act like you want to change. That moment, or the story that you gave about that person smiling at you in a store, still stays with you years later. It's a moment, so you can almost tell when it occurred. And then you started to practice it. And now you show up and now you have a seasoned practice. But the benefit and the strength that you bring to the table is the fact that this is not a talking head presentation. You're living and doing what you say that you should be doing, which is, I think, a real testimony. And I really, really like that exercise, because we all get into this, self-talk. There's nobody that talks to us more than we talk to ourselves. And typically we say things that we would never allow anybody else to say. So you can build up the resentment. I've seen this personally. I've seen this in family members. I've seen this in clients and friends. They can build up, they can bring on the resentment and load it up. Or as you talked about, the real important thing is being able to let it go. So I really want to thank both of you, because you delivered a very strong and seamless message from different perspectives, but it really did center on building confidence and self-esteem, both internally and externally. So we'd like to, thank both of you. We'll be here again next Wednesday. What I wanted to be able to say is the fact that we'd ask you to pay close attention to our emails that are coming out. Not the one I'm going to distribute this week, but I'll probably mention it this week as well. But on June the 1st, we're launching our website and our e-resource manual. And team members have been working on it behind the scenes. And when you see this, you're going to love it. It's going to be a free download, a free resource for you. And we're very, very proud of what has been constructed. So with that, I wish you all of you the best, and we'll talk again next week. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Peggy.